morning. My name's Sarah Ann Arup. I'm a reporter with POLITICO. Welcome to this session of POLITICO Live's Competitive Europe Summit, where you're joining myself and a stellar panel to discuss due diligence, which I hope you'll find just as exciting as watching the football last night. Our topic will be today, is it time for a global mechanism for greener and more ethical supply chains? I think most would answer yes, and the next question really is how, but we'll get to that in a second. Upcoming EU rules to make sure that supply chains are ethically sourced are one of the hottest topics right now that the Commission is currently trying to tackle. And it's politically explosive because it has the huge potential to reshape how EU companies decide to strategize and source their supply chains worldwide. Now, before we begin, just a quick reminder, please do submit your questions to me via the Swapcard app in the questions box next to the live stream. Also, please do join in the discussion by answering our poll, which I'll read. Under the future sustainable corporate governance rules, how should companies be held liable if they breach human rights and/or environmental standards? You can also tweet about this event using the hashtag #PoliticoCompetition. Now, let me introduce our speakers. Joining us today are Paul Nemetz, who's the Principal Advisor for Justice Policy at the European Commission's DG Just. Thank you so much for having stepped in a bit last minute to replace your colleague, Lucrezia Busa. Now, we also have Raphael Glucksmann, a member of the European Parliament with the Socialists and Democrats group.
Hello.
We have Pedro Oliveira, who is the Legal Affairs Director at Business Europe. Hello, Pedro.
Good morning. Good morning, Sarah.
Good morning. And we have Richard Gardner, who's Senior Campaigner for Corporate Accountability at Global Witness. Welcome, Richard.
Hello.
Now, thank you all for being here with us today. And let me kick off this discussion by asking you, Raphael, what does due diligence mean for you personally? Can you give us an example, a concrete example of where you think that this new law could make a difference?
Well, due diligence for me, it means that when I go to shop in my street, and I buy myself a Zara shirt or a Nike shoe, then I'm not part of a crime against humanity in China. We know that today, in today's world, those who are actually selling these shoes and these shirts are not held responsible for any of the crimes committed during the fabrication of these shoes. For instance, Zara can work with Huafu, a Chinese supplier that is exploiting thousands of Uyghur slaves, but Zara will not be held responsible for the crimes committed along its value chain and allowing this company to make profits. So that's the end of impunity. That's basically what it means is it brings back responsibility in a pyramid of irresponsibility that is today's globalization. And it shows to European citizens that the European Union can make a difference, can have an impact, and basically that the citizens themselves can take back control through the European legislation. Indeed. And this is, I think, an amazingly important moment and a really crucial discussion we are having today.
This is crucial, and thank you for sharing what this means for you. Now, just taking a step back, zooming out, Pedro, what do you reckon will be the impact of sustainable corporate governance and due diligence on the way that European companies are competitive in Europe? How could this even have an impact on global trade?
Well, Sarah, this is one of the fundamental questions that has to be made around this debate. It's definitely a hot debate, as hot as yesterday's games. But the important thing here is as Mr. Glucksmann was saying, there's expectation from stakeholders, there's expectation from consumers that the products and the services that they procure, that they are sustainable. So even without any sort of legislation that will come, companies need to adapt. Companies need to respond to these expectations from consumers, from governments, and from the wider society. Now, in terms of the potential impacts, I think from Business Europe perspective, we are not against any upcoming measures. From our perspective, the most important thing is that they become workable and proportionate. Because if they are not...
How would this impact competitiveness?
Because if they are not workable, companies will become risk averse, which means they will tend to pull out of markets, which will not be helpful on a number of situations. First of all, it will not help local communities, because let's not forget that the foreign investment from European companies bring growth and jobs to local communities in third states. The companies are also ambassadors of EU values, EU rights in these states. So the EU can see companies as a vehicle to bring those values on the ground. And by having companies pulling out, you will have other actors that will not follow the same standards and rules, intervening and filling up those spaces. So at the end of the day, we need proper rules, adequate, which to avoid that these impacts are taken. And then, as I was saying at the beginning, there is a space in the sustainability for companies in the EU to be competitive. So that's without any question, but we need to do it right.
Now, competitiveness here seems to be the key question of the future due diligence law. Maybe, Richard, would you like to jump in here and see how you view this question of competitiveness, global competitiveness of EU companies with due diligence?
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, indeed. I mean, the way we would view this is actually the EU has a real chance here to be a global leader, in fact, on this, and to set a standard of what it means to be ethically competitive within business. And in that sense, the law that we're looking for, I think the direction the Commission needs to take, is something that is all-inclusive, includes all companies across all sectors. In that way, you drive a high common standard, and to the point just raised by Pedro about pulling out of potentially companies pulling out of sectors or leaving risky markets. If the law truly includes all companies in all sectors, in that way, there would be less removal of companies from certain risk-averse areas, because they will have an incentive to stay in there because their competitor has to stay in there. And another point I would add is that it's not just about targeting EU companies, but all companies acting within the EU. So we're looking to have something that actually would be non-EU companies acting in, so they could not undercut the competitiveness. Because really this is about not exporting the human rights and environmental impacts of doing business in the EU, but making sure anyone that's profiting from acting in the EU themselves are up to the same high standards.
That's actually a great bridge to shift over to Paul. Since we're lucky to have you here, I would like to take a look at how this future law is shaping up within the Commission, and precisely this question of which companies, for instance, could be subject to future due diligence laws. If you could tell us more about that, and then also give us a flavor for perhaps what you see in terms of supply chain depth. So do you think that it should go for first tier, second tier, or even further down?
Well, what is important here is that we create a level playing field, both between companies in the European Union and also between companies which are companies of the European Union and companies of third countries which supply goods or services into the Union. And that answers already part of your question. A level playing field means that in principle all companies have to have similar obligations, because if we don't do it, it will be possible for some to undercut the level of obligation. And that's exactly one of the complaints, and we have listened very carefully to business. We're trying to make a law which is good for business, And one of the big complaints against similar laws which are going forward in member states was that there's no level playing field between EU member states, and people also have made the experience in business that a voluntary system doesn't work exactly because if things are voluntary, not all companies are asking their customers in China or elsewhere for the same level of compliance. And therefore, these customers in China, in particular the big ones, as long as the rules were not obligatory but voluntary, they have laughed away many good, willing companies from Europe who have actually tried to do due diligence, and it didn't work. It wasn't practical. The system of voluntary didn't work. So that's the first part of the answer. Of course, we have also in the European Union a long tradition of asymmetrical rules. We regularly try our best to give a preference to small and medium companies, and I'm sure this approach will also find its way into the initiative on sustainable corporate governance. Now, as to the depths, I think we need to be serious and honest with ourselves. We don't want a law which is just a gesture and basically doesn't work. So I would think that the depth of the obligation has to depend on the level of risk, and it has to be a level of depth which makes a real change in this world. And everybody knows that if we don't go far enough here, it will be very easy to circumvent the obligations of these rules, and that's not the type of business we're in. If we make a law in Europe, as previous colleagues on this panel said, it has to make a difference and it has to work in practice.
So in other words, you're saying no German law with just Tier 1.
Well, what I'm saying is that the initiative of the Union has huge advantages over the German law, because first of all, it's all of Europe and all European companies which then will stand together in the face of their suppliers. And, suppliers may be able to laugh away this or that company as long as principles are just voluntary, and they may be able to laugh away if it's just the Germans. But the combined buying power of the European Union with its 400 million people and with very high per capita income is such that I don't think we will have those discussions afterwards anymore, because this argument that suppliers then will just choose to supply to American customers or what have you, I don't think that is real. The buying power of Europe is so high that I believe there will be anticipated compliance of many suppliers who want to keep their market, and these discussions will be not difficult, or at least much less acrimonious than they are when you only have a national law, or for that matter, even worse, if you only have a voluntary regime. I think we can be self-confident. Europe is big enough to make a difference in this field, and I think we will make the life of businesses who want to go down this way, and I think that's the clear trend of business, we will make their life much easier, because there will be less competitors who are able to say, I don't care,
and
because
actually,
all of European companies have
precisely on that point of companies going in that direction, it seems as if SMEs, though, are having a bit of a hard time with this future law. And so I was wondering whether, Richard or Pedro, you would like to jump in on how you can see SMEs coexisting with due diligence.
Maybe I can say words on this, but just before, just touching upon the level playing field, because from our perspective, there are three points on the level playing field. One is about same rules for those who uncovered, so wherever country they are in the EU. Then there's the same rules, which will include also the companies that are not established in the EU but active in the EU. And then there's the same rules for all companies in general. From our perspective, the two first points, so non-EU companies should be covered if they're active in internal markets. So this is without any doubt. This is about a level playing field. Same rules to the ones covered definitely as well, because this is one of the major advantages of having a EU initiative in place. And then should we have the same rules for SMEs as well? But this we have a bit more questions, because at the end of the day, SMEs, they struggle with leverage when they are active in their supply chains, because they don't have the means to map everything that is happening. They cannot impose behaviors on their suppliers. They have a lot of difficulties on this. Plus, in obtaining information is also not easy, because they even faced with refusal to obtain information, fake information, and their suppliers in countries like big countries that we know are even afraid of providing any information about what is going on. So smaller companies will have difficulties. We cannot be naive to say that our combined purchasing power will at the end of the day compensate, because smaller companies, they will have more obligations. So we have to consider their needs when drafting the legislation, whether they will be in or out of the legislation, because SMEs, they will be covered anyways. They are part of complex supply chains. And even on a contractual basis, the big companies, the banks, anybody who will trade with SMEs will require them to fulfill certain standards of due diligence.
Now, I think that point about SMEs having a particularly hard time, or perhaps having limited resources, is well taken by everyone around the table. But what are some of the concrete solutions that others are looking at here in terms of SMEs? Perhaps Raphael or Richard, would you like to jump in here?
Well, actually, I can jump in. We fully agree that there should not be the same burden for every company, every size. And that's why the risk approach, an approach based on the risk, is, I think, the right approach. Because you can have a small or medium company that has a huge impact on human rights and environmental rights on the ground. And therefore, it will be killing the idea of the legislation to a priori exclude this company that has a huge impact in a risky field from the legislation. But obviously there is a risk approach, and not all companies should have the same obligation. But let me just insist on three things, because I think the key word was said. We are going to use our purchasing power to make a difference, our buying power to make a difference. But for this difference to be real, first you have the scope that needs to be large, but the scope of the value chain is key. And you asked the question, and there was no clear response, but it cannot be limited to rank one supplier. It has to cover the entire value chain, because we know perfectly well that the most severe violations occur often at the end of the chain or the beginning of the chain. And second, we need to enable victims to obtain justice in front of courts. So we need liability. And for it to be possible, then we need to do what we agreed on in the parliament, which is a reversal of the burden of proof. And you know, we have managed to build a large consensus among various political forces in the parliament. And this was complicated, but we came to a very ambitious text. And that should be the basis, because there is a consensus. And it's not about being from the right or the left, or being green or being anti-green. It's really now a momentum for the Commission to deliver on the basis of what the Parliament has put.
And precisely on this point of liability, which was also actually the poll that we wrote up. I'm just going to read out the poll now and then switch over to that subject. So under the future sustainable corporate governance rules, how should companies be held liable? And people answered, half of the audience, in fact, answered that it should be through civil liability, i.e. the company should be able to compensate for damages, so someone should be able to sue a company. Only 30% said that criminal liability was the best option, so those responsible should go to jail. And only 20% said that there should just be administrative liability, i.e. just fines to companies that breach the future law. Now, on liability and enforcement, which are crucial, of course, to underpin due diligence, Pedro or Richard, perhaps, could you walk us through the best way, in your view, to enforce this law and a concrete example, perhaps?
Indeed, and maybe just to address the poll that you've just read out there, I think in reality you need all three to have some sort of a significant incentive mechanism for this due diligence legislation to have any sort of teeth. I mean, it is a preventative mechanism. It's about companies identifying and mitigating their risks before it happened. But unless you have that real and very clear threat that when victims are harmed, they can actually take companies to court, or that governments can impose fines, or that indeed directors could be held criminal for negligence, then you're never going to have any sort of real corporate change. So that's going to be really important. And in particular, because it's about reshifting the balance between corporate power towards having an even level playing field between victims, between those that are impacted, and corporates, which currently doesn't exist. Things like the burden of proof being too high, access to justice being too high, the costs and timing. In terms of enforcement, I mean, that is the legislative side. In reality, we do need to have competent authorities that are able to understand and digest information that companies give it to them, that can also flag problems and do on-the-spot investigations when needed. And I think in this instance at the moment, what we don't have is companies currently reporting information into relevant competent authorities. So the burden is overwhelmingly held by NGOs who must bring these cases. I think if you look at the current devoir de vigilance, the French law, which has made great strides in this, unfortunately the enforcement mechanism there isn't fully functioning, and it really is up to civil society to bring these cases forward. In this instance, we'll be looking for much more of a proactive approach from competent authorities, working together, be they in various member states, that they can actually start addressing some of these problems when they happen, because many of these problems, Mr. Glucksmann mentioned one in particular related to the garment sector, do come up in the press, are publicly known, are available, and a competent authority should be able to proactively act on this, essentially before it's too late. Because by then, despite the fact victims can claim compensation, they are victims, and by then harm has occurred. It's about preventing it before it happens.
So, Paul, you're hearing all of this. What does the Commission think? What are you currently considering, or what are you not considering in terms of liability?
Well, in the Commission, in DG Justice and also DG Grow, we're working very closely together on this. We're considering all these options, and I would tend to agree that there must be elements of a wide variety of measures, because enforcement is key. So, as I said, we are in the business of proposing a law which will work and which will make a difference. And I'm very comfortable that in today's conference, 50% of the present said they are in favor of civil liability. I personally agree that anyway, the barriers for civil liability cases, from China or Pakistan or wherever, are huge, and the costs involved are huge. So, we don't really need a debate about, oh God, European companies would all go bankrupt because of civil liability. That's not the case. I think what is important in having a civil liability mechanism combined with public enforcement is the incentive, the basically, that people know if they don't fulfill obligations, there will be consequences, and these consequences can come from separate sides. So it's not possible to capture, let's say, the mechanism which brings consequences about. And my prediction is, like in other areas, in competition law or in data protection, civil liability afterwards is very rare to work. It is a preventive mechanism that companies know there could be civil liability, and that changes their behavior in the right way. And so we need a combination of all of these.
Now, let's imagine that you go ahead with civil liability, for instance. Who would then police this system? This is a question from Louise Curant, one of our viewers.
Well, the European law is interpreted in a binding way, and in order to ensure uniform application across all our member states by the European Court of Justice, which takes binding decisions which bind all administrations of member states and all national courts. So this classic and well-tested mechanism to ensure uniform application and interpretation of the law would also apply to this system.
Perhaps, Pedro, would you like to come in on the question of liability, on how you see this?
Yes, Sarah, with pleasure. Well, this is probably one of the major questions in the whole debate, the enforcement and liability measures. But before going into the liability, just to go back to one thing that Richard mentioned about companies not passing the information to authorities. Actually, we hear from our members that sometimes it's the opposite, that the authorities, that the delegations of the Commission on the ground in third states have a lot of information about the situation on the ground, but they are not, but companies cannot see it. So there is a bit of a lack of one authoritative opinion about the situation on the ground that would help companies to make their decisions and to act properly within the value chain. So liability is an important thing, but we cannot forget that these measures of due diligence need to be accompanied as well by other enabling measures. Now, on the liability, very quickly, the main question. From our perspective, we need to have, if there is a liability regime that's associated to the European measure, it needs to fulfill a certain number of criteria from our perspective. So we are ready to have that debate. We have identified a few elements. I can mention a few, of course. We cannot forget that we are not operating in a vacuum of laws, that there is already a lot of liability measures in place by EU law or by national law. So, and companies are being taken to court if they misbehave. So we cannot, this is not the measure that will correct everything. There are already other measures that are in place. Now, for the specific elements, how we would see a potential liability regime, it should be one that does not overlap with existing liabilities, national liabilities. One that would not make companies liable for everything that happens in the value chain, specifically when they demonstrate that they took effective due diligence. The normal civil liability theory measures should be applied. In this case, the causal link between the damage and of course the lack of due diligence. So this needs to be taken into account. And if I may say two more other points, one about the criminal sanctions. I would like to remind that in France, the Constitutional Court, and very well so, said that at the time of the discussion of the devoir de vigilance, that criminal liability would not be appropriate for the French law because the concepts were simply too vague. So you basically put people under criminal liability for very open concepts such as human rights, fundamental freedoms. The principle of legality does not allow for this type of situation. And then one final point, sorry to take so long,
no,
but from our perspective...
Point, actually, the previous point, I think that Raphael could probably come in here because since you're talking about the French situation and the French law, how do you, Raphael, see this question of how the French law is working out in terms of enforcement? And do you think that there are any lessons to be learned here for the EU directive?
Yeah, I think that the French law was a very good setup, but what we are witnessing now is that it's quite hard to enforce, and that's why I fully agree with what was said before, that we need a combination between civil liability and administrative liability, both to have an access to justice, which the French law allows, but also to prevent in a more active way. But I want to react to what was just said, because for us it's very important to understand one thing, is that it's not an obligation to have a process of due diligence. There is a need for an obligation to produce results. So even if you enact some programs in your value chain and have a due diligence process, and your value chain is still tainted by slavery or by very severe crimes, then you need to have a liability, even if you took steps to actually monitor and report. So for people to understand, it's not just a question of monitoring, it's a question of actually cleaning up your value chain. And I understand that you might not have control over Chinese suppliers, for instance, but as a result, once you note that you don't have control and that you cannot make sure that there is no slavery in your value chain, then you have to change your value chain.
And precisely on the point of, for instance, a Chinese value chain where you're unsure whether there is slave or forced labor, we know that the US has already taken the measure of installing an import ban, and we're hearing from, for instance, EVP Valdis Dombrovskis that this could also be the case in the EU soon. Paul, if I can just turn to you on that, how would this import ban, first of all, are you actually considering seriously such import bans, and if so, how would it mesh with due diligence?
Well, in the Commission, of course, all DGs are working on this proposal, which is a corporate law proposal, and by the way, goes beyond just the supply chain issues. It addresses the need to align corporate board decisions with a long-term view on sustainable economy, very much in line with what big investment funds like BlackRock and so are asking the companies in which they take shares to do. So we're not only discussing the supply chain, but as to your precise question, all DGs are involved, and it is true that in terms of the legal base, an international trade instrument, which could include bans of import, can be done in European Union law by a qualified majority, while this measure of corporate law needs a broader support, and that is, let's say, one of the issues to look at. But the work plan of the Commission foresees a corporate law instrument of a broad nature, which includes the supply chain due diligence, but also measures relating to corporate law and board obligations. And it's not a pure trade instrument. Let me say one thing about SMEs standing alone and the need to have information. I think that's a very crucial point. Obviously, we don't want to create an instrument which doesn't work, and we fully recognize that it's impossible for small SMEs to do things on their own. That's why we are looking into mechanisms like, for example, the possibility to discharge your own obligation to do due diligence collectively, through a trade association, which can be sectoral or cross-sectoral. We already have such trade organizations in Europe. We have, for example, Corporate Responsibility Europe, rather big organization which does this already. I know also that in many sectoral organizations, preparations are being made to discharge the duty of due diligence checks in the supply chain together. And I think the point of information is also good. I mean, if 1 or 2 or 3 companies have done a good due diligence in a supply chain, why should others have to do it again? So I think we also have to look into ways of bringing this information together and making it then useful for everyone. So as to ensure that we are not duplicating work and therefore costs for our companies.
And so were you mentioning private audits? Did I get that correctly, that you're thinking about perhaps having auditing companies also help out on this front?
Yeah, obviously. I think, if you are, let's say, a textile shop, in the high street, which is not very big, you would have to avail yourself anyway of experts to do this job, and the costs to do this job on your own, probably for a small and medium company, depending on the size, of course, but often will be very high. They may be prohibitive. And in such a situation, I think it is important to foresee mechanisms that nobody is left alone in this task. And part of the thinking is about the ability, to look at, have others already done this, or to discharge the obligation of due diligence through collective action, basically doing it through a trade organization or other forms. And this could be also audit companies which do it.
Okay.
Obviously.
And so, Richard, what do you think about this news that audit companies could be involved, that there could be rationalization of information, so perhaps just a few SMEs or a few companies doing the groundwork for others? How do you see this?
So, I mean, it's going to be clear that there will be an exchange of information for this legislation to work, as there is for any legislation. But what we definitely have a position on is that there should be no way to essentially outsource or discharge your obligation to an auditing firm or any other third party. Whether or not an auditor or another consultant or something helps a company with its due diligence or any other process internally is completely normal and will continue to happen. However, it should not exempt the company from their due diligence obligation or absolve them from harms that they are connected to. And that has to be kind of crystal clearly made within the new legislation, if indeed there is a role to be played. I think there has been examples in the past where firms have been audited and human rights and environmental abuses have still happened. So the role of auditing in that sense has been challenged. But I would also just add that in terms of SMEs as well, there is a need to really unpack that term for this discussion too. I mean, SMEs have a threshold of 250 employees and 2 other metrics in terms of turnover, etc. But if we're to have the risk-based approach that people here seem to agree on, it's about unpacking where exactly those risks are and where the size of impact is going to be. SMEs make up more than 90% of the EU economy. Any blanket exemption essentially will see no change in the environmental and human rights impact of the EU economy. However, if we look within the SME package on what sizes, on what sectors, etc., to make sure that at a minimum we hit high impact with a long-term goal to get everyone involved, you really will have some sort of impact and steering clear of a broad exemption. But just to return on that to auditors, third parties can play a role to help with due diligence, and we see it in the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive. There is something there in terms of their role, but it does not exempt a company from their obligation and does not absolve them from the responsibility to not cause harm.
And if we just switch over to the Sustainable Corporate Governance package as such, which, as Paul mentioned, contains both due diligence rules and also rules for directors' duties. So where boards, for instance, look at how to become more sustainable in their strategies. Perhaps if, Paul, you could just tell us, there have been rumors that this could be a split deal because Nordic countries and some companies, etc., have been against the director's duties. Where are we on this?
Well, I mean, in European lawmaking in initial phases, you find someone who's against something, on any point, no problem. So, that doesn't immediately lead to the Commission withdrawing or for that matter splitting. But of course, the Commission is in the business to make proposals which afterwards work. And my personal view on this is rather the opposite. If you have a little bit more problems, not just 1 or 2, it's often easier to come to a package deal rather than to, parcel up things in terms of different proposals, and then, maybe one proposal goes through and the other one dies. That's not smart. But also in substance, there are important links between the supply chain issue and corporate governance generally, including directors' duties. So we are looking now at all options, and the proposal will be made in autumn, and the work plan foresees one proposal for the time being. And let's see where our assessment goes. This is in the end an assessment of political opportunity, which will be taken by the College of Commissioners. But let me also emphasize, neither the supply chain part nor the director's duty part is an anti-business proposal. The director's duties, we orient ourselves very much towards a philosophy which is on long-term profitability, to orient towards long-term profitability, so not boom and bust. And we orient ourselves very much towards empirical studies, which are not only our own. We have done studies ourselves, but also by third parties. Again, you know, the big investment houses, BlackRock and so on, which all show one thing. Those companies which orient towards the long term and which also take into account in their strategy the risks relating to sustainability in terms of environmental risks, social risks for their employees, but also in the supply chain, so which are responsible citizens. Those are the companies which both make in the long term most profits, but also suffer least, and we have very clear evidence on this in the COVID downturn, they suffer least when there is a downturn. And we want European industry not to be a boom and bust, but we want them to be long-term profitable and to work in a sustainable, profitable way. And that's what the proposal serves.
That's a strong message there that you've left us with. Just to wrap up very quickly, you each will have 5 seconds to tell me more about what you learned from this panel today. What are you going to take with you? Please, Raphael.
Well, actually, I learned that we all share an objective, which is to have due diligence, but the devil is in the details. And so it's still a very long process. And we will support the ambition of the Commission, and we hope that this ambition will meet ours, which is to actually make a difference. Because if we have a small ambition, then actually this will be mere reporting, and we won't have changed anything. And this is really a tremendous opportunity for Europe. We are always complaining about Europe's weakness, about the fact that we cannot do anything in the global world. And now we have an opportunity to show to our citizens that actually EU is making a difference and is behaving as a global leader. So the ball is yours, and you will find support in the Parliament if you have an ambitious directive.
Thanks. Moving on to Pedro.
So basically in a couple of seconds, that what I take out from this is that the EU can make a difference, but the rules need to be made workable, and I think everybody agreed with that. The level playing field is a very important point here, not only the same rules to everyone, but also including outside players in the EU. We all need to look into the SME question, whether with exemptions or with other types of measures. So a lot of things need to be considered there. And then one last thought, that this is about dialogue. I mean, this is not about discussing anti-business measures. These are due diligence will have to be applied by companies. And at the end of the day, all the actors involved, the NGOs, business, Commission, the member states, need to take ownership. And this can only be done via dialogue and the process to come.
Thanks. Richard, do you want to say very quickly what you learned?
No, indeed. I think what I learned as well, similar to, it's great to see alignment where you have the EU institutions, Parliament and Commission, you have business and you have NGOs. I think we're all aligned that this is needed, this needs to happen, and it needs to happen sooner rather than later. And maybe specifically on the point of civil liability, I mean, to see the poll there coming out so strongly for that was important. And also Pedro's comment about how business is willing to engage on this point, because we have seen a lot of pushback in that sense. So I think I would definitely encourage business to come to the table proactively, discuss this, discuss how it can work, and achieve the goals along the lines of what the Commission has said.
And Paul, just in 20 seconds, what have you learned from today?
I have learned today that the conditions for adopting this law on European level are much better than they were on member states, where in member states there were heated discussions, a lot of pushback, a lot of unnecessary excitement. I think the discussion on the EU level is more constructive. I think I see quite a broad alignment also in our discussion today. And that also has a reason, because we can rely on our buying power, the size of the EU. We can create a level playing field which national law and voluntary rules cannot create. So there's a lot in it also for business. And I think we're all together in it to do good things in this world.
Thank you very much to all of our 4 speakers. Our next and final session of the day is coming up at 2 p.m. Brussels time. Giorgio Leali will be moderating an interview with the Canadian Minister of Small Business, Export Promotion and International Trade, Mary Ng. Stay tuned.